Hey, guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. I couldn't believe it when I got the call from my neighbor while I was recovering in the hospital. That nosy, entitled Homeowners Association president Karen had actually taken my prized possession, my rare 1967 Shelby Mustang GT 500, worth over $250,000, out for a joyride while I was away. I'd been battling pneumonia and was stuck in the ICU for over a week when this went down. As soon as I was able to leave, I rushed home and sure enough, my garage was empty. Karen had made a copy of my house key for emergencies years ago when she first wormed her way onto the Homeowners Association board. I guess she considered her desire to drive my rare muscle car an emergency. Never mind that she didn't have permission, and I had explicitly told her to never set foot on my property again after multiple run-ins over her trying to enforce bogus Homeowners Association rules. I called the police immediately to report the theft. Thankfully, I had two witnesses, my neighbor who saw Karen driving my stolen car, and my garage security camera footage, which clearly showed her sneaking into my garage and driving off with my baby. Her audacity was mind-blowing. The cops paid Karen a visit, and she tried to say I had let her borrow the car, but they weren't buying it. Once I showed them the garage footage and statement from my witness, they arrested her on the spot for grand theft auto. Karen's entitled attitude had finally caught up with her. She was looking at some serious prison time for this crime. I was informed that because the car was worth so much, this fell under a felony charge that could mean years behind bars for her. As much as I wanted to see Karen get the book thrown at her, I decided to show some mercy. The thought of little old Karen surviving in maximum security prison was just too much. So I agreed not to press charges if she resigned as Homeowners Association president, wrote me a public letter of apology, and agreed to stay far away from me and my property forever. Karen resisted at first, convinced she could get away with just a slap on the wrist. But when even her lawyer told her she was looking at 5+ years, unless I showed leniency, she caved. I received a profuse letter of apology and her resignation effective immediately. The Homeowners Association board even agreed to dissolve entirely after this unfortunate incident. I still can hardly believe Karen's nerve. To think she could just take my prized possession for a joyride while I was laying helpless in the hospital. Some people really do think they're entitled to anything they want, but her joyride turned into the ride of her life, a one-way ticket to the slammer. In the end, justice was served. My baby is safely back in my garage where she belongs. Karen won't be bothering me again anytime soon, and the power-hungry Homeowners Association board is no more. This grand theft auto turned into a grand theft auto ver for me. The next one is a pro-revenge story. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage, and the bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. Bob, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints, and the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told, "Don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets," because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway, and so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Bob's work. The representative became angry, as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door casing included fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Bob wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a stay-at-home mom in a nasty rental with two tiny children, while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank and Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot, my dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney, Tom, and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tiling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank and Bob would win. The attorney, Tom, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then, abruptly, Tom smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents, "tomorrow." So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else started to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" Tom, in a sweeping theatrical gesture, placed a deed on the table. "My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." Bob's attorney stared at the deed and then turned and stared at Bob. "You built a house on land you don't own." Bob nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered, No," Tom said firmly. "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state at once." My dad said he'll remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week, with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment, but to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people. It was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank and Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Bob. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. The next one is a petty revenge story. I want to be perfectly clear before I start about something. My mom could not physically breastfeed me. She had a medical condition that kept her from lactating. Therefore, she had to formula feed me. I know that's a hot topic among moms, and I don't want her to get any hate for how she raised us as infants, especially since the feeding situation was something that she couldn't control. My mom had my older sister back in the early 2000s when Facebook first started to become popular. My mom had just had my sister, so she thought it might be a good idea to join a mom's group there. I wouldn't give her hate for that either. She learned very quickly about how moms actually act online. She hasn't been on Facebook much since. However, in the short time she was there, she was insulted in the group because of the fact that she was formula feeding my sister and not breastfeeding. She told them that she couldn't lactate. They didn't care. The meanest mom in the group was a local mom, which is important for later. This mom, Susan, was incredibly cruel to my mother. Susan told my mom that my older sibling would get sick and die because she wasn't sharing her antibodies through breast milk. She also told my mom that her baby would grow up to resent her because they didn't have that bonding time. A few years went by and my sister started preschool. It just so happens that my sister was in the same class as Susan's kid, Dylan. My sister has always been the healthiest person I know, and the worst she ever had in her life was a bad stomach flu. Not only that, but she has always been very affectionate and attached to my mom. My brother and I are the exact same way too. A few months after my sister started school, my mom realized that Dylan is Susan's kid after my sister came home in tears. Dylan was bullying her. My mom went to the school, but they refused to do anything about it because bullying builds character and bullying is normal at this age. My mom ended up asking my sister some questions and found out that Susan came to pick Dylan up before her, one of the things he bullied over. So my petty mother came a little earlier every day until she managed to come at the same time as Susan. On that day, my sister was so happy to see my mom. She went running to my mom as she usually does, and my mom told me that Susan was shooting her nasty looks. While my sister was running to my mom and hugging her, Dylan was refusing to leave because he still wanted to play with the toys. Susan had a sour look on her face, and my mom kept coming before or at the same time as Susan to pick up my sister. Eventually, Susan started picking Dylan up way later in order to avoid my mom. Sometimes the best petty revenge is simply to be more successful. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I've been working in childcare for a long time, exactly 20 years. During that time, I've worn many hats: babysitter, nanny, preschool teacher, and mother's helper for numerous families. I hold various certifications and boast excellent references, which consistently affirm my expertise and competence to prospective families. Recently, I found myself job hunting again and came across a family located a bit outside my usual area. They were willing to pay me quite well, although it was still below my true worth. Given the tough times, I understood their offer. They explained that their daughter had been withdrawn from school due to health issues and required some discipline. So I decided to don my super nanny hat and take on the challenge. Turning unruly toddlers into well-behaved children is my specialty. Thus, I embarked on day one with this little girl, and boy, did I have my work cut out for me. They handed me 3 objectives: ensure she used the potty, critical due to her kidney-related health issues; make sure she washed her hands, given her compromised immune system; and ensure she picked up her toys. Simple enough, right? Absolutely not. So, within the first hour at their home, it was potty time. I asked her, "Can you go potty?" but was met with a resounding no. So, I tried a new approach. "You need to go potty." This triggered a torrent of waterworks, screams, cries, and an epic struggle to get her to cooperate. You would think I was leading this child to a slaughterhouse. While I was making some progress, her dad came downstairs from his office to console her and told her she didn't need to use the toilet. I reluctantly conceded. Next up was lunchtime, and she needed to wash her hands. This triggered the second meltdown of the day. I tried explaining to her the importance of hand washing and that she could eat as soon as she was done. We went back and forth for about 10 minutes before her mom emerged to hand feed her, so she didn't have to touch her food. Whenever a parent stepped in, the child would boss them around and get her way. After lunch, she became inconsolable. I inquired about her nap schedule, and they told me she slept from 6 p.m. and stayed up until midnight, waking at 8 a.m. I couldn't help but think that a toddler needed more sleep than that. I tried to reason with them, emphasizing that she couldn't endure a full work day without proper rest, but they resisted. We endured 2 more days of screaming, fighting, and parental undermining. On day 3, I decided it was time to have a serious talk with them. I had a come-to-Jesus moment, expressing, "Hey, I can't make any progress if you keep undoing everything I try." They responded with, "You should try to make her like you first, and then she'll listen to you." I desperately wanted to retort, "Does she even listen to you guys?" But I held my tongue. They flatly instructed me to cater to her whims until she liked me, and only then start enforcing boundaries. I made one last plea, warning them that this approach would reinforce the undesired behavior and take longer to correct, but they remained steadfast. Do what she wants. So, I embarked on day 1 of malicious compliance. When Dad had an important meeting and needed uninterrupted time, the toddler decided she wanted her father's attention. I said, "Let's go get him." He said, "You can do whatever you want today. I'll race you up the stairs." We sprinted up the stairs, and she burst into his office during a client call. Then the toddler decided she wanted her mother, and we dragged her into the room to play. Both parents were now reluctantly playing at the insistence of this little tyrant. Every time she told me to leave, I complied. They attempted to call me back and distract her, but she would insist that I leave, and I would reply, "It's what she wants, I have to do it." They were visibly irritated. This child had now received everything she desired, and predictably, after lunch, she entered into a meltdown of epic proportions. I casually remarked, "I bet she's tired." They contested, claiming it was simply her resistance to change. She screamed for an hour and a half. They decided to prepare her a snack, convinced she was hungry, but I insisted she was tired. I had developed an acute sense of an overtired cry after 20 years of experience. Dad scooped up the toddler and took me outside for a conversation. As he explained how to do my job, I sat there shaking my head. He asserted that he knew his daughter better than I did and would know if she were tired. I smiled and looked him in the eye, stating, "Oh yeah? She's asleep on your shoulder now. She must have been tired. If only there were someone who knew that." When he realized the crying had ceased and she was passed out on his shoulder, a look of utter defeat washed over his face. He tried to backtrack and find ways to prove me wrong, but he couldn't. It was almost as if I knew something about kids. I continued my malicious compliance for 3 more days. The parents were exhausted, and I thought we might finally make some headway. However, when the toddler reached her overtired point after lunch again, they instructed me to take her to the library to get her out of the house. Strangely, while telling me to sanitize every surface she touched, they also admitted they didn't buckle her into her car seat because she didn't like it. That was the breaking point, and I quit on the spot. I immediately reported them to the service I worked with. As far as I know, they were terminated as clients, and Child Protective Services may have become involved. All I know is that they had to make up 4 workdays at night after she fell asleep, which, if you recall, was at midnight. I felt like I had achieved the perfect revenge. The next one is an entitled people story. I have known Colette for over a decade. She has kids from a previous relationship and is one of those obnoxious parents, the kind who honestly believe her toddlers are perfectly behaved angels who can be taken anywhere and never cause any upset. She is completely delusional and thinks her kids never cry or have emotions other than sunshine and maturity beyond their years. Correct me if I'm wrong, but kids who are like that tend to be that way due to fear of consequences. Painful consequences. Colette isn't the greatest human, but she also doesn't abuse her kids. She is actually on the other end of the spectrum and spoils them rotten. Earlier this year, she married a single dad. This put a strain on our relationship because I wouldn't listen to her badmouth her stepson, who I'll call Caleb, age 7 years old. Caleb is on the spectrum and has some issues with impulse control and emotional regulation. He's in therapy for that, but Colette hates him regardless. I could endure listening to her delusions about how perfect she thinks her kids are, but shut her down for the nasty things she tried to say about Caleb. What remained of our friendship broke entirely a few months ago. That was when Caleb's mom said she needed a break, and his dad needed to step up. Colette lost her mind. I'll let your imaginations fill in the blanks for all the ableist and hateful trash she vomited. I told her she should have known this was a possibility. Isn't it obvious that if you date someone with minor children, you have to be prepared they could be a full-time responsibility? Colette screamed that of course she knew, but that only applied if Caleb's mother died. It wasn't fair that she ruined Colette's fairy tale romance where her new husband stepped in as dad for her kids, and Caleb was someone else's problem. I heard through the grapevine that Colette is getting divorced. Apparently, she told her husband that her kids are perfect, his aren't, and he has to choose. The better family they created, her 2 kids, and him, or the out-of-control brat even his ex doesn't want anymore. He chose Caleb. Knowing Colette, she's probably angry at everyone but the person who actually causes the mess. Herself. The next one is an entitled parent story. For context, hi, I'm Craire, or as of late, Delta Kruger. Need to get that fixed. I'm the 27-year-old lad of this story. I am considered a high-functioning autistic individual, officially disabled by government standards. My mother, for a long time, but especially these past 4 years, has been taking in and managing my checks from the government to keep the household afloat, making use of everything but $100 of it, which often got absorbed in moments of crisis as well since I didn't spend much. While doing so, she was sowing seeds of doubt and fear into my mind about ever learning to live on my own, stating I was very far from ever reaching that. I myself didn't really try to struggle or push my way out even when I turned 18. She offered to sign me up as a dependent, but I thankfully declined. I decided for the good of the family to keep working with them. That changed about 4 years ago. 4 years ago, my developmentally held back brain decided to say, oh, now it's time to teenager, and I suddenly craved independence, looking every which way for a way to flee gracefully. Every time, though, there was some unfortunate situation or action that meant that if I left with my two incomes, my mother became my PSW, which has its own irony later on, the family would fall apart, and I'd be dooming all the animals, some of which were never listed on our lease at the time and were hidden during every inspection. Now, what happens when you cage a teenager that so desperately wants to be their own thing? They get rebellious. 3 years ago, I got a therapist through my state insurance program. And after venting all the hoops my mom was making me jump through, and all the work that was piled on me due to my mother's bum knee, and the stupidly high expectations of me that would always end up creating screaming matches with her over those 3 years, she finally said to me roughly a week ago from this post, "That literally sounds like an abuse case." I initially dismissed that and said, "I'll keep it in mind," as we ended the call that day, only to then immediately after get chewed out for jumping on a request my mom made earlier in the day, as she had requested research for something that'd make another lengthy story. But regardless, she basically chewed me out for hounding her in an ill mental state due to the current situation, despite telling me 5 minutes prior to do the research for her. That's when I went back to my room and texted my therapist to start filling out the paperwork. 1 day later, Mom and I get into another spat, this time about the dishes, which were my daily chore. Sure, it was assigned to me, but my drive to do crap for her was dead by that point when my effort could be shot down on a whim, even though it was ordered. The argument is hazy in my head for many reasons, but the main one is, Mom went feral the moment I snarked like a teen would. She slammed her way into my room to start grabbing crap and hucking it on the lawn, screaming for me to get out, breaking one of my monitors in the process. Dad stepped in and told her that since I was over 18 and on the lease that I was legally given 30 days notice, which is when she stopped, turned to me, said, "Well then I'm gonna make those next 30 days hell for you," and walked to her room. Dad let me get the few things she did get on the lawn back inside at that point, and I sat down at my chair. Then it dawned on me. She played herself. For years she said that if I went away she would have to get rid of everything, and I mean everything. It was all propped up by my SSI and the income she got being my personal support worker. Well, now she had given me and the government valid reason with her behavior alone that even if she rescinded the 30-day notice that we couldn't keep our home anyways. It was refreshing. In that moment, I felt courage well up in my chest. She couldn't manipulate me anymore. She fell into what she had made of her life and was blind to my connections I made for years outside the family, constantly slamming them for being liberals. I took that renewed energy to reach out to those friends, those found families, my lovers, and even my grandparents. I looked through my cards and emails and found my disabilities care workers' info and told of the situation, and burnt the midnight oil chasing my new life, while my mom literally pounded the adjacent wall between my bedroom and her bathroom, screaming like a banshee about not hearing me pack fast enough. To keep this from going on for ages, I'm going to be brief on the next few stages to now. Grandparents saw this explosion brewing for years, opened arms, and let me take my belongings, and my bearded dragon Pancake, in while Mother was away on psychiatric care. With my caseworker's help, I got my SSDI under control. I got guidance on what steps to take next, and they're doing research for intermediary places after grandparents. My BF and I are looking into joining together and living somewhere in Washington, with my found family chipping in as well. As of today, I'm officially disowned from my family. My mother has not only disowned my grandparents, but also forced Dad to as well. I tried to contact them to drop me off the phone plan so I can keep my phone number, and all I got was the statement of disownment, and that further contact will lead to a restraining order. I got a special state-related order to have their firearms reclaimed since Mother is a psychopath, and I have my grandparents locking their doors now out of fear. I'm waiting for my case manager to get back to me to have my documents extracted from their residence. And basically, all I got to do is play the waiting game, watching my parents burn because Mom pushed all their connections away. Even my brother, who's stoic as all hell, showed he was ready to fly too. So the main thing to take away from this is, learn to value yourself. And judge the words of those even closest to you, for you never know if you're just a pay pig to your own mother. If people want, I can refine those breezed over parts, but that's enough to get the picture. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.